Two men, strangers from different worlds, meet on a park bench. What they share changes everything. A story about loss, hope, and unexpected friendship. Stay till the end, and don't forget to subscribe. The leaves were coming down steady that afternoon, soft and slow like they had time to die. Golden, rust-colored, the kind that stuck to your boots when the ground was just wet enough. The air smelled of bark and damp earth, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, twice, then went quiet. Richard sat on the far end of the bench, legs crossed at the knee, a navy scarf wrapped carefully around his neck. His coat was wool, thick, the kind that said money. His silver hair was combed neatly, and he looked like he had stepped out of a men's magazine, even though his face was tired, eyes hidden behind fine sunglasses. He wasn't reading, just sitting, breathing, still. The only sound was the wind threading through branches, until someone shuffled toward the bench from the walking path. The man was wrapped in a threadbare gray blanket, stained and frayed at the edges. He wore no gloves, just cracked fingers that held a cardboard sign with shaky black letters. Just trying to survive. He paused when he saw Richard already sitting, then gave a half-smile, like he was used to rejection before even trying. But Richard surprised him. "You can sit," he said, motioning with his hand. The man blinked, then nodded once and lowered himself onto the far end of the bench. They sat in silence. The leaves fell. "Name's Elijah," the man finally said. His voice was hoarse, like it had traveled through years of dust and cold. "I don't bite. I only cough when it rains." Richard gave a soft laugh, dry and brief. "I'm Richard." "Nice coat, Richard." "Thanks." Silence again. Then Elijah leaned forward slightly. "You come here often?" Richard nodded. "It's quiet. I like the sound the wind makes this time of year." Elijah smiled with the corner of his mouth. "Me too. Reminds me of when I was a kid. Fall meant raking leaves for $1. You ever rake leaves for $1? "No," Richard said, folding his hands. "My father paid a man to do that." "Of course he did." Elijah chuckled. "Figures." Richard turned slightly to look at him. "You make assumptions fast. I've seen your shoes, man. I know those shoes don't touch wet grass unless it's on a golf course." Richard smiled. "Fair enough." They sat another moment, strangers sharing space, silence becoming less awkward. Then Elijah asked, not accusingly, just curiously, "So what brings you out here, Richard?" "No phone, no coffee, no company. Not the usual rich guy setup." Richard stared ahead for a while before answering. "Just came from the hospital," he said. Elijah turned, face softening. "Bad news." Richard nodded slowly. "Stage 4. Pancreas. Not a lot of fight left to put up." Elijah didn't speak right away. He shifted slightly, as if bracing himself. "Damn," he said finally. That's real bad." Richard breathed in through his nose, held it, let it go. "Yeah. How long?" 6 months, maybe. Doctors always give numbers. They don't really know. Just numbers." "I know," Richard said, "but I think they're right." The wind picked up. A gust threw a few leaves right across Elijah's shoes. He reached down, brushed them off carefully. "I had a sister," he said after a while. "Breast cancer. Took her in a year. She was younger than me. Nicer too." Richard turned. "I'm sorry." "Yeah, me too. She used to say life doesn't owe you anything. But sometimes it takes anyway." Richard stared at Elijah. "You talk like a philosopher." Elijah laughed, deep and genuine. "Man, sit on a bench long enough, and you get real wise. Especially when you don't got much else." They both laughed quietly. It was the kind of laugh that comes with no energy but all sincerity. "You from around here?" Richard asked. "Used to be," Elijah said. "Lived in the South End most my life. Raised by my grandmother. She ironed shirts for a living, but man, she had a spine of steel. We didn't have much, but she made it feel like enough. And now," Elijah gestured around. "Now I got the bench." Richard looked at him for a moment. "No shelter." "Sometimes. But I move a lot. Some of them are worse than the street. Places where people forget how to be human." Richard nodded slowly. "I think people forget how to be human long before that." Elijah looked at him sideways. "You say that like you've seen it too." "I have," Richard said, "but from a different angle." "Tell me." Richard hesitated. "My company, tech firm. 3 years ago, we laid off 600 people, all through email. Never saw a single one of their faces. Stock went up 12% the next quarter." Elijah whistled low. "Damn. Cold world. I didn't stop it. I just didn't care enough." Elijah was quiet for a beat, then said softly, "Well, you care now." Richard looked at the falling leaves. "I think so." The sun was starting to dip, painting the tops of the trees orange gold. Richard stood, adjusting his scarf. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. Elijah nodded. "I'll be here. Unless it rains. Then I'll be under the bridge on Ninth." Richard pulled out his wallet, hesitated, then put it back. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and handed Elijah a small packet, hand warmers, sealed. Elijah took them slowly, his hands shaking. "Appreciate that," he said. Richard nodded. "See you tomorrow." He walked away slowly, hands in his coat pockets. Elijah watched him go, then looked down at the hand warmers. "Damn," he whispered. "Rich folks don't usually bring those." He tucked them into the inside of his blanket and leaned back on the bench. The wind sighed again through the trees, and Elijah smiled. The next day, it rained. Not heavy, not yet. But the sky hung low and gray, and the kind of drizzle that seeps into your coat collar settled over the park like a warning. Richard stood by the coffee cart near the eastern gate. He didn't usually buy coffee from vendors, but today he did. One for himself, black. One extra, with cream and 2 sugars. He didn't know what Elijah liked, but figured it was worth guessing. He made his way to the bench, same one, same place. Empty. A few wet leaves had gathered where Elijah had sat yesterday. The cardboard sign was gone. So was the man. Richard stood there for a moment, coffee cup cooling in his hand. He thought of the way Elijah had said, "I'll be here, unless it rains." Bridge on Ninth. With a sigh, Richard turned up the collar of his coat and walked. The bridge under Ninth wasn't easy to find if you didn't already know it was there. It wasn't scenic, just concrete, with a small embankment that sloped down to a grimy drainage stream. A few tents huddled in the shadows, blue and gray, battered by weather and time. Richard hesitated near the edge. A man with a beanie and one shoe gave him a skeptical look. "You lost, old man?" "I'm looking for Elijah," Richard said, lifting the second coffee cup. "He said he might be here." The man pointed with his chin. "Check behind the second pillar. He don't talk much when it's wet." Richard stepped carefully through the mud, circling the pillar. There he was. Elijah sat with the gray blanket draped around his shoulders, staring into a plastic cup half full of rainwater. His feet were tucked under him, and he was shivering. Richard knelt. "You said you'd be here." Elijah looked up, surprised, but not too surprised. "You brought coffee?" "I didn't bring an umbrella." Elijah chuckled, teeth chattering. "Figures. You rich types always plan for flavor, never for weather." Richard handed him the cup. "Try it. Might be too sweet." Elijah took a long sip and sighed, steam curling from his lips. "Too sweet," he said. "But that's good." They sat together under the bridge, side by side on a folded tarp. "Didn't think you'd actually show," Elijah said after a while. "I didn't think you'd vanish." "Didn't vanish. Just shifted." The cars above them passed like thunder overhead. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Richard said, "You weren't wrong yesterday. About the shoes. Or the golf." Elijah smirked. "I know people. I didn't used to know anyone like you." Elijah gave him a look, not offended, just honest. "Yeah, I can believe that. I worked in rooms where people had private chefs, private jets, private doctors. We talk about saving the world while stepping over janitors in the hallway. And now you're sitting under a bridge with a homeless guy." Richard smiled thinly. "Maybe I'm trying to figure out who I am without all that." Elijah sipped more coffee. "Too late for redemption?" "Maybe, but not too late for honesty." The rain thickened. A sharp wind cut through the opening beneath the bridge. Richard shivered, then chuckled. "I don't think I've ever been this cold in my life. First time for everything. I keep thinking about what the doctor said. About how sometimes things happen fast near the end. One day you're walking, next day you can't feel your legs." "That happened to your dad?" "No. He died in his sleep. Quiet. I didn't even get to say goodbye." "I did," Elijah said softly. "To who?" "My daughter." Richard froze. "I didn't know you had a—" "Yeah." Elijah's voice was thin now. "Her name was Maya. She had this big laugh. Like, obnoxiously loud. You'd be embarrassed in public, but you'd still laugh with her." "What happened?" "Drunk driver. Broad daylight. He walked away with a scratch. She died on the scene. She was 10. Richard looked down. "I'm sorry. I used to sell insurance, believe it or not," Elijah added. "Wore suits. Had a nice condo. Took my girl to school every morning. Life felt full. What changed?" Elijah gave him a look that was somewhere between exhausted and hollow. "Losing her took the color out of everything. I kept going for a while. Drinking too much, missing meetings, burning bridges. Eventually, I just stopped showing up." "And no one came to find you?" "Oh, people tried. My sister, old coworkers. But I wasn't ready. I wanted the world to hurt the way I did. Richard felt something twist in his chest. I think I understand that, he said. I kept working after my wife died. Buried myself in expansion, mergers. Pretended the grief wasn't there. And now, Richard looked at the steam rising from his cup. Now it's all I feel. The rain softened again, fading to mist. The air smelled of wet cement and earth. Elijah pulled his blanket tighter and turned to Richard. You know, man, you don't have to come back tomorrow. Richard tilted his head. Why not? You already got your truth. Your moment. I'm not here for a moment, Richard said. I just don't want to die without being seen. Not as a CEO. Not as a patient. Just as a man. Elijah nodded slowly. Yeah, I get that. They sat there until the rain stopped. Two men on a tarp beneath a bridge, talking like it mattered. Because it did. The next day, the sun came back, but weakly, like it had forgotten how to shine. The park was still damp, leaves plastered to the paths like scattered old letters. A few early joggers passed, breath fogging the cold air. Richard arrived at the bench carrying 2 bagels and a brown paper bag and another cup of too sweet coffee. He sat, checked his watch, then looked toward the path leading from Ninth. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then footsteps. Elijah appeared slowly, blanket around his shoulders again, this time layered under an old army coat someone must have donated. He walked like his knees ached. When he reached the bench, he looked surprised. You came again. Richard smiled. Thought we made a habit of it. Elijah eased himself down and took the coffee with a nod. And you remembered the sugar. Richard handed him a bagel. Elijah blinked. You serious? Why not? Elijah chuckled. Rich folks always come bearing lessons. Not breakfast. Well, Richard said, maybe this one's learning. They ate in silence for a few minutes, chewing while the wind rustled the trees above. Then Elijah said quietly, I almost didn't come. Why? Shame. Richard looked over. Elijah shrugged. I ain't told that story in years. About Maya. About losing everything. I got used to saying less. Pretending less happened. Maybe it's good you said it. Yeah. But afterwards it's like, the silence hits harder. Richard nodded. I get that. Elijah took a deep breath. I used to go to this grief group. For about 6 weeks. Didn't say a damn thing until the last session. When I finally spoke, it was like tearing my ribs open. Told them I used to sing to her at bedtime. Gospel stuff. Soft. The next day I didn't go back. Why not? Because I didn't want to hear myself say it twice. Richard stared at the ground. That makes sense. After a moment, Richard said, I've never told anyone this either, but I wasn't a good husband. I provided, paid for everything, gave her a car, a summer place. But I was cold, always working, distant. Elijah watched him quietly. She had this laugh, Richard said, almost like a memory was tugging at him. Not loud, just warm, like she meant it. And I can't remember the last time I made her laugh. Elijah swallowed his bite. What was her name? Claire. She stay with you till the end? Richard nodded. Pancreatic cancer. Took her in 9 months. She was braver than I ever was. She held my hand when I broke down. Elijah stared off across the park. You ever think the people we love are stronger than us? All the time, Richard said. A boy rode by on a small bike, his dad jogging behind, both laughing. Elijah watched them for a long moment. His eyes were unreadable. I used to dream about her. Maya. Not nightmares, just dreams. She'd be standing in our old kitchen, waiting for cereal, asking for cartoons. And I'd think, God, she's real. She's still here. And then I'd wake up and remember all over again. Richard said nothing. He just sat there, present, solid. You ever dream about Claire? Elijah asked. Not often. I keep hoping I will. It's like my brain's protecting me. Elijah looked over. Or punishing you. Maybe. The wind shifted. A gust threw a handful of brittle leaves into the air. They danced briefly, then fell. You know what I miss most? Elijah said, holding someone's hand. Richard turned. Not sex. Not kissing. Just contact. A palm. Fingers. Even a shoulder bump. That stuff? That's what hurts when it's gone. Richard didn't respond right away. Then he slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object, flat, round. A stone. He turned it over in his hand. Claire gave me this once, he said. We were in Italy. She picked it off the beach and said, You don't hold on to people, Richard. You just carry little pieces of them. He passed the stone to Elijah. Elijah held it gently, like something fragile. It's warm. It was in my coat pocket. Elijah looked at him. You want it back? No, Richard said. Hold on to it. Just for now. They sat there, watching the park fill up with quiet Sunday noise. Dogs tugging leashes, kids kicking leaves, lovers walking close but not touching. Elijah put the stone into the inner pocket of his coat. You keep showing up, he said. I thought maybe this was a one-time thing. I think I need this as much as you do. Elijah nodded slowly. We're two ghosts in the same graveyard, he said. Not ghosts, Richard answered. Just two men who still have something to say. It had started to get colder. The kind of cold that slides through your sleeves no matter how thick your coat is. The trees in the park were nearly bare now, branches clawing at the sky like cracked fingers. But the bench remained theirs. Richard was already seated when Elijah arrived, his blanket now doubled under a second-hand jacket someone at the shelter had tossed him last week. His boots were mismatched, one black, one brown, but warm. That mattered more. Richard handed him a cup without a word. Black coffee this time. Elijah didn't complain. They sipped in silence. You ever think, Elijah said after a while, that some people just get picked for pain? Richard glanced over. Like, you come out the womb and boom, someone up there's already marked your file. This one gets grief. This one gets a smooth ride. This one gets to beg for change while people cross the street to avoid him. Richard stared ahead. Yeah, he said. I used to think that. And now, I think everyone gets pain, Richard said slowly. But some of us get better costumes to hide it in. Elijah nodded, eyes fixed on a passing jogger. Yeah, I guess suits don't mean peace. No, but they can buy silence. They sat still for a moment. The wind shifted. Geese flew overhead in a crooked V. You ever have money? Richard asked suddenly. Elijah laughed. What kind of question is that? Curious kind. I had a savings account, Elijah said. Retirement plan. Life insurance. I used to wear polished shoes and sell people comfort with a smile. And now, Elijah smiled bitterly. Now I watch those same people avoid my eye at intersections. Some of them I used to know. One guy rolled up his window when he saw me. I recognized his car. That's brutal. It's not even the worst part, Elijah said. The worst part is how fast people move on from you. Like you were never part of the plan. Never in their phone. Never shared a laugh. Richard nodded slowly. I felt that in a boardroom, he said. You can give your whole life to a company and still get replaced in a week. Hell, in a memo. People don't see people anymore, Elijah said. Just titles. CEO. Homeless. Cancer patient. Felon. As soon as they name you, they stop looking. Richard looked at him. So what do we name each other? Elijah turned. Eyes steady. Man to man. That's it. They drank their coffee. Around them, the park moved like a slow, tired machine. A woman walked by holding a poodle in a sweater. A groundskeeper raked leaves into rustling piles. Elijah sighed. You ever notice no one ever asks what I did? They just see the blanket and think, drugs, jail, crazy. Richard frowned. What did you do? I told the truth when it was inconvenient. Called out a boss for fraud. He flipped it. Got me canned. Blackballed in the industry. Couldn't pay rent. Couldn't pay support. One thing led to another. You know the story. That's rough. Elijah smiled wryly. Rough as sleeping behind a dumpster and praying the rats stay on their side. Richard winced. I've never had to worry about rats. No, Elijah said. But you've had to worry about time. Richard glanced down. His watch ticked quietly. Yeah, he said. Time's become a different thing lately. I don't think in months anymore. I think in sunsets. Good way to think. Scary, too. Elijah rubbed his hands together. You got a will? Yes. Got regrets. Many. Got anyone left to tell them to? Richard shook his head. No kids. No siblings. Parents gone. I was always too busy to make time for a second life. You mean a real life? Maybe. Elijah stretched his legs out. You ever think maybe you're lucky to know you're dying? Richard blinked. That's a hell of a thing to say. No, think about it. You get to say things. Tie up loose ends. Make peace. Some people get hit by a truck or have a heart attack alone in a stairwell. You at least get the chance. Richard stared at him, processing. I hadn't thought of it that way. Yeah, Elijah said. Time's a gift if you spend it right. The sun had started to fade behind the trees. Richard stood slowly, brushing a few leaves off his coat. Same time tomorrow? Elijah looked up. If it don't snow. Richard smiled. Then I'll bring gloves. The cold came faster now. Not winter yet, but the kind of cold that got into your bones if you sat still too long. Richard came with a thermos this time, real coffee, not cart stuff, and 2 pairs of cheap gloves he'd bought at the corner pharmacy. They weren't fancy, but they were thick and dry. Elijah accepted them wordlessly, tugging them on with stiff fingers. Didn't know rich men shopped at drugstores. Don't tell anyone, Richard said. Might ruin my reputation. Elijah smiled. They sipped quietly. You ever carry something too long? Elijah asked suddenly. Richard looked over. What do you mean? Something that should have been let go, but you keep holding on like it still has weight, even if it's just a memory. Richard took a breath. I carried a lie for 20 years. Elijah waited. I always said Claire and I were solid. Stable. But the truth is, she asked for a separation 6 months before the diagnosis. We were already sleeping in different rooms. Why? I was cold. Distant. I didn't know how to love someone who needed me emotionally. I only knew how to provide. Elijah nodded, slowly. Yeah. Sometimes presence is worth more than rent money. She never left, Richard said. Not after the diagnosis. She stayed. Cared for me. Called off the separation. Elijah's voice was quiet. That must have hurt. It did. But I let her. I let her take care of me until the end, like it was all okay. I never told anyone about that part. Not even her family. I wanted to protect the image. And now you're telling me. Richard looked up at the sky. Because I don't want to carry it anymore. Elijah said nothing, but his face softened. Then he said, You want to know what I carried too long? Yeah. My father's silence. Richard turned toward him. He was there, but never there. I mean, physically, yeah, but emotionally? Stone. I'd bring home drawings from school and he'd grunt. I'd win spelling bees and he'd nod. No hugs. No. I'm proud of you. Just pressure. Richard listened. When I lost Maya, Elijah continued, I realized I'd become him. Not all the way, but enough. I never told her how proud I was. I figured she knew. But kids don't know unless you say it. Richard's voice cracked. I think that's true for grown-ups too. Yeah, Elijah whispered. And now there's no one left to tell. The wind blew harder through the empty trees, and a few stubborn leaves clung to branches like they were afraid to fall. Richard took something from his coat pocket, a photograph, worn and creased. He handed it to Elijah. It showed a young Claire, sitting on a balcony in Florence, her face tilted toward the light, eyes closed in peace. She hated having her picture taken, Richard said. But I caught this one without her noticing. She looks alive, Elijah said, holding the photo delicately, like it might dissolve in his hands. She was. So alive it scared me. Elijah handed the photo back. You kept it all these years? I had it framed on my desk. Took it down after she died. It felt too loud. They sat in silence again, the kind that doesn't hurt anymore. Then Elijah stood slowly and reached into his coat. He pulled out a small, folded piece of cloth, faded, yellowed at the edges. A child's sock. This was hers, he said. Maya. From when she was 2. I kept it. All this time. Richard stared at it. Why? Because I couldn't keep her. And this was something she left behind that didn't fade. It smells like dust now, not her. But I can still feel her when I hold it. He handed it to Richard. Richard didn't take it. He just looked. You ever think, Elijah said softly, that grief isn't about remembering someone. It's about not forgetting ourselves while we do? Richard blinked hard. I think that might be the truest thing I've ever heard. They packed up quietly that day. Richard poured the last of the coffee into Elijah's cup and held out a folded napkin. I wrote something, he said. I don't know why. It's not a poem. Just thoughts. About time. About endings. Elijah accepted it carefully. I'll read it, he said. I promise. As they parted, Elijah called over his shoulder, Same bench tomorrow? Richard smiled. Same bench. Same ghosts. The frost came overnight. The park's grass crunched underfoot, and the benches looked dusted in sugar. Richard arrived early, wrapped in an old camel-colored coat, his scarf tighter than usual. His breath fogged in the air as he poured steaming coffee into 2 paper cups from his thermos. A familiar shuffle came from the path. Elijah, slower than before, his blanket layered under the same army jacket, moved stiffly, like sleep hadn't done him any favors. His gloves, those cheap pharmacy ones, had a tear now, but he still wore them proudly. He sat without speaking, took the coffee, sipped. Cold? Richard asked. Always. A long silence passed, broken only by crows overhead. Then Elijah said, You know what's funny? If we'd met 20 years ago, we'd have hated each other. Richard chuckled. Probably. I'd have thought you were another smug exec. You'd have seen me as What? A token? Some PR story? Honestly, Richard said, I probably wouldn't have seen you at all. Elijah nodded. Exactly. They sat with that truth for a while. It didn't hurt. It just was. I was angry back then, Elijah continued. Angry at systems. At how hard I had to fight for what some folks were handed at birth. I didn't understand any of that, Richard admitted. I used to think the world was fair because I worked hard. I didn't see how the ladder was bolted to the ground for others. Elijah looked at him. What changed? You did. Elijah raised an eyebrow. I mean this, us, Richard said. This bench. These mornings. Talking to someone with no reason to lie to me. I've had thousands of conversations, but none that made me question who I was until now. That's wild, Elijah muttered. World spins funny. A small girl ran past with her mother, laughing, chasing her own breath. Elijah watched her go, then said softly, Maya would have been 20 this year. Richard looked down. She wanted to be a vet, Elijah said. Would pick worms off the sidewalk after rain so they didn't get stepped on. She once nursed a squirrel with a broken leg in a shoebox for 3 days before it bit her and ran off. She cried for a week. She sounds brave, Richard said. She was everything I'm not. That's not true. Elijah shook his head. It is. I gave up. She wouldn't have. Richard leaned back, sighing. Giving up looks different from different places. Maybe you didn't give up. Maybe you just got tired of carrying it alone. Elijah didn't answer. Can I ask you something? Elijah said finally. Of course. When you die, what do you want to be remembered for? Richard was quiet. Then, not the business. Not the money. I think. I want someone to say I finally listened. That's it. That's everything, Richard said. For someone like me? That's a revolution. Elijah smiled. You're not the man I thought you were. You're not the man I would have noticed, Richard replied. They laughed, low and genuine. The wind picked up. Elijah shivered, pulling the blanket tighter. Richard hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. I brought something today, he said. I wasn't sure I'd give it to you. He handed Elijah a small velvet pouch. Elijah opened it and blinked. Inside was a silver wristwatch. Worn, but beautiful. This was my father's, Richard said. Passed it to me when I turned 21. Said, time is the only thing you can't earn back. Why are you giving it to me? Because you've given me more time than anyone else in the last 5 years. Elijah held it gently, almost afraid to touch it too long. I can't take this. You can, Richard said. I want you to. I want something of mine to be carried by someone who sees me. Not a nameplate on a boardroom wall. Elijah swallowed hard. His eyes were glassy. Thank you, he said. They sat in silence. Not out of awkwardness, but reverence. Two men, midlife and past it, reshaping each other at the 11th hour. As they stood to leave, Elijah said, You ever think we could have been friends? In another life? Richard smiled. We are. In this one. That morning, the city woke under a thin blanket of snow. Not enough to stop traffic, not yet, but just enough to hush the world. Trees stood frosted and white, park benches wore soft crowns, and the air carried a quiet kind of magic, the kind that made your breath visible, your footsteps hushed. Richard arrived late. Elijah was already there, gloved hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup, the silver watch peeking out from under his frayed sleeve. He looked up and smirked. Look who's keeping a homeless man waiting. Richard huffed, half laughing, half apologizing. Traffic. Slippery. You all right? I'm okay, Richard said, but he looked a little paler than usual, a bit more hollow behind the eyes. They sat. The silence between them was now a space of comfort, not absence. You ever think about God? Elijah asked. Richard tilted his head. Sometimes. Not like I used to. How was that? Transactional, Richard said. Pray for good returns. Promise to be a better man. That kind of thing. Elijah smiled knowingly. I used to pray that Maya would sleep through the night without nightmares. Every time it worked, I said thank you. When it didn't, I said I must have done something wrong. Richard looked over. Do you still pray? Elijah stared at the frozen pond. I talk. I don't expect answers. Maybe that is the answer. A boy threw a snowball across the field, laughing, chased by a golden retriever twice his size. The joy in it echoed, bounced off the trees and into the bones. Sometimes, Richard said, I wish I'd had a child. Elijah looked at him. Never wanted one? I think I did. But the life I chose, there wasn't room. Claire wanted to try, once. I told her the world wasn't safe enough. The truth is, I wasn't ready to share myself. Elijah nodded. Parenting's not about being ready. It's about being there. Richard smiled faintly. And you were. I tried. Lord knows I tried. They sipped coffee. A snowflake landed on Elijah's hand. Didn't melt right away. You know, Elijah said, a lot of people think life's about building. Success. Property. Achievement. Legacy, Richard added. Right. But I think maybe it's about witnessing. Just being there for someone. Seeing them. Letting them see you. Sounds simple. It ain't. No, Richard agreed. It's not. Elijah shifted. You ever wonder what your funeral will be like? Richard chuckled, dry. I used to imagine hundreds of people. Colleagues. Partners. A slideshow. Polished words. And now I just hope someone says I listened. That I changed. You will, Elijah said. You already have. For a long time, neither spoke. Snow drifted softly through the air like ash. Then Elijah said, you know that sock I showed you? The one that belonged to Maya. Yeah, I almost lost it once. Shelter fire. Some guy knocked over a heater, and everything went up. I ran out with just that sock and a bag of bread. That's love, Richard said. Elijah shrugged. It was desperation too. But yeah, maybe they're the same sometimes. Richard looked down at his own gloved hands. I think love is what you reach for first when things are burning. Elijah turned. You ever get scared? Lately? All the time. But not of dying. Of not mattering. You matter to me, Elijah said. Richard turned toward him, moved. You too. A light flurry began, covering Elijah's blanket, dusting Richard's lapels. You think this is the end of the season? Elijah asked. Could be. You think it's the end for you? Richard didn't answer right away. Then, softly, I can feel the days getting smaller. Elijah reached into his coat, pulled out a tiny notebook and pencil. What's that? Started writing again, Elijah said. Just little thoughts. Stuff you say. Stuff I feel. If you go, I don't want it all to vanish with you. Richard looked away, blinking fast. Thank you. No, man. Thank you. They sat until the cold chased them away. Before parting, Richard reached into his coat and handed Elijah a folded piece of paper. What's this? A letter, Richard said. For whoever finds me. I don't want them guessing who I was. Elijah nodded, tucked it into his notebook without reading. See you tomorrow? Unless I can't, Richard said quietly. They didn't hug. They didn't shake hands. But something passed between them in that moment, something wordless and warm. Two men in the snow, holding pieces of each other's truth. It was the first morning Elijah arrived before Richard. The bench sat exactly where it always had, facing the frostbitten trees, a little wet from the melting snow. Elijah stood beside it for a while before sitting down. His breath hung in the air as he rubbed his hands together, silver watch gleaming on his wrist. He checked the path. No Richard. Not yet. 30 minutes passed. He finished one coffee, lukewarm now, and started on the second one he'd brought, just in case Richard forgot his own. Still no sign. Elijah told himself not to worry. Maybe Richard overslept. Maybe the cab was late. Maybe traffic. But the thing was, Richard had never been late without warning. And they didn't have phones, not between them. That was the unspoken rule. If you show up, you show up. If you don't, the silence says enough. After an hour, Elijah stood. Walked. He passed the playground, where a girl in a red coat hung from the monkey bars. She reminded him of Maya. He looked away. Crossed the bridge on 9th. Backtracked to the east gate. Checked the coffee cart. Nothing. The man at the cart, recognizing him now, said gently, Looking for your friend? Elijah nodded. He didn't come by today. Elijah walked back to the bench. Saturday. Then pulled out the notebook. He flipped to a fresh page and began writing. December 6th. Snow still on the ground. I came early. You didn't. I'm not mad. I just hope you're warm. Wherever you are. That watch still ticks. You know that? Your father's voice, still in rhythm on my wrist. If this is your way of saying goodbye, okay. But I wish you'd said it with your eyes open. I wish you'd let me see the ending, not just feel it. The next morning, Richard still didn't come. On the third day, Elijah went to the hospital. He didn't know where else to look. He had no last name, no phone number, just one clue, the clinic name Richard had once mentioned offhand in a story about tests and scans. It took some convincing. A nurse with kind eyes finally agreed to check with a whisper. You didn't hear this from me. Yes, she said. There was a Richard here. Room 514. Oncology. He'd been admitted 3 nights ago. Elijah found the room. He stood at the doorway for a long time before entering. Richard lay pale under the sheets, eyes closed. Thinner. His hands, those clean, purposeful hands, looked folded more in surrender than rest. The heart monitor beeped in slow rhythm. Elijah stepped closer. Richard stirred. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, then a ghost of a smile. "You came," he whispered. "I thought you might have left." "Almost did," Richard said, voice raspy. "But I wanted to see you again. You could have told me. I didn't want our bench to become a goodbye." Elijah sat beside him. "It already is." For the next hour, they spoke like old friends. Not about death, not much. Just about the bench. The leaves. Maya. Claire. God. The cold. Richard said, "I left you something." In the drawer. Elijah opened it. A sealed envelope. Inside, a letter. A deed. And a check. "What is this?" "The letter explains," Richard said softly. "I sold the condo. The check is for you. I set it up through a trust, no red tape. The deed is for a small shop. Secondhand books, downtown. You once said you liked words." Elijah stared at him. "I can't." "You will," Richard interrupted. "You kept me alive longer than I deserved. Let me return the favor." Elijah's throat tightened. "I just wanted a friend. You were my friend." That evening, Richard slipped into sleep. Not death. Not yet. Just rest. Elijah sat beside him, holding the notebook. He flipped to a new page and began to write. December 9th. "You're still here. Breathing, barely. But here. Funny how we started as strangers, and now I feel more like your brother than anyone in my bloodline. If tomorrow doesn't come, I'll sit at that bench anyway. And I'll wait. Not for you, but for whatever you left behind." The shop was small. Dusty windows. A faded sign that read Page Turners. Locked when Elijah arrived the first time, key in hand, check folded in his pocket like something too heavy to unfold just yet. He stood out front for a long while, watching traffic slide by on wet streets. He could almost hear Richard's voice beside him. "Go on. Open it." So he did. The air inside was stale, but not dead. Like an old room that had been waiting, not forgotten. Books lined the walls, most left behind by the previous owner, Richard's note explained. She ran it for 30 years, he had written. Didn't sell much, but she loved it. Reminded me of someone. Elijah ran his fingers across the spines. Rows of forgotten stories. Quiet company. He took a deep breath. Then, from his coat pocket, he pulled out the small sock. Maya's. He placed it on a shelf near the counter. "You're home now," he whispered. Richard had passed 2 nights earlier. There was no funeral, per his wishes. No ceremony. No speeches. Just a cremation, a letter to the lawyer, and a final gift. Elijah wore the silver watch every day now. It ticked steady on his wrist, grounding him, like Richard's presence never fully left. And every morning, before he opened the shop, he sat at their bench. Alone, yes, but not empty. He wrote. The notebook, now almost full, had become part journal, part scripture. Stories about Claire, about Maya, about cold coffee and shared silences. He added little quotes from books he found on the shelves. On the inside cover, he had written, "Two men met at the edge of their endings and found something worth beginning. One afternoon, a girl came into the shop. 17, maybe. Hoodie, bruised lip, eyes heavy with something unspoken. She didn't say hello, just browsed. Elijah watched, didn't interrupt. After a while, she brought a book to the counter. Their eyes were watching God. He rang it up, but she flinched when he named the price. Her hand trembled, reaching for coins. Elijah stopped her. Keep it." She blinked. "What?" "You look like someone who needs that story right now. Trust me. Take it." She hesitated, then nodded. "Thanks." As she turned to go, he added, "If you ever want to talk, I'll be here." She looked back. "You a therapist or something?" He chuckled. "No, just someone who listens." That night, Elijah sat on the floor of the shop, surrounded by scattered books, and opened his notebook again. January 12th. "I gave away a book today. Not because I could, but because I should. You'd like her, Rich. She reminds me of Maya in a sideways kind of way. Something cracked, but not broken. Not yet. The shop is quiet, but not empty. Like the bench. Like me." He thought of Richard often. Not as the man who died, but the man who changed. Who chose to see someone on a bench in a park. Who reached across all the boundaries men are taught not to cross: class, race, silence, and simply said, "I see you." Elijah smiled to himself. He closed the notebook, and for the first time in years, he felt like he'd arrived somewhere. Winter was fading. The snow had melted into the streets, puddles reflecting a weak sun. The park's trees were bare skeletons, waiting for spring's return. Elijah sat on the old bench one last time, the silver watch ticking softly beneath his sleeve. His notebook rested on his lap, pages filled with memories, confessions, and quiet hope. He looked around, the empty path, the rustling leaves, the faint sound of children playing in the distance. A woman approached, the same age as the girl from the shop, but this time with a smile, a different light in her eyes. "Elijah," she asked. He nodded. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "That book, it changed things for me." Elijah smiled. "Glad to hear it." She sat beside him. "It's hard," she admitted, "feeling like you don't belong anywhere." Elijah glanced at the sky. "You're not alone." She looked surprised. "We all carry stories," he said. "Some heavier than others. But sharing them, that's how we heal." He pulled the notebook from his bag and handed it to her. "Here," he said. "Maybe it'll help." She took it carefully, as if it were something precious. "I hope to return it one day. I'll be here." As the sun dipped low, Elijah stood. He looked once more at the bench, their bench, and smiled. "Thank you, Richard," he whispered, "for seeing me, for letting me see you." He folded the notebook and placed it inside the shop. Then he walked away. Back at the bookstore, a new sign was hung in the window. "Page Turners, stories that find you when you need them most."